Mark is our coordinator tonight, our moderator and coordinator of this series. He has his own way of doing things, and it's turned out to be wonderful. So I'm looking forward to your involvement and his. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat, and it's wonderful in a university setting to be recognized for my own way of doing things, since when I went to college it wasn't recognized. It was recognized or appreciated. I thank you all for coming, and thank you. Before I get started, I'd like to also put a little pitch in for the wonderful art that's downstairs. There is beautiful, beautiful art, and I've already told Steve, who's organized it, that I wanted one of the pieces. So that's I've just pushed it, so now I get one, right? It's Rhode Island after all, isn't it? But it's wonderful, and Steve continually brings in innovative work and puts it up in wonderfully attractive ways, and brings everything together, because you could tell in his mind, I want people to see this, I want people to see this, right? You get very excited, and this work that he puts up really deserves that kind of excitement. It's great, so I'd like to advise you all to make sure you spend some time looking at it. I thank you so much, Kat, for the introduction. Always wonderful, and I appreciate it, and I'm taping just your introductions because I have a sort of tendency to feel depressed every once in a while. So every once in a while I'll just listen to those introductions and feel much better. Thank you. Let me introduce the panels, but before I do that, I want to tell you your role. We have a small but very intellectually gifted group of people here, I can tell, as well as being excited and innovative and interested. So I need your help. I tend to, like all of us, think in very structured ways, and I need people to break me out of my structure. I need you to be able to ask some questions that I don't ask, give me some feedback, as well as the panelists some feedback that they might need at the time. We need your input. Let me just put it simply as that, and I mean that truthfully. I'm a big believer in diversity of all kinds. The system needs it for its own health, psychologically and ecologically. So you are my diversity here. And so please feel free to, at any point, come up here or raise your hand, and I'll come down and ask a question. It's quite an interesting and complicated subject. And to tell you the truth, I went to the Industrial School of Labor Relations at Cornell, and I failed just about everything. So I really do need some people who passed a test or two. Joan Fitzgerald, welcome to Providence, Rhode Island. Is Professor of Law and Public Policy at Northeastern University and the author of Emerald Cities, Sustainability and Economic Development. Thank you very much for agreeing to be here. Robert Margo is a professor of economics and African American studies at Boston University and at the National Bureau of Economic Research Incorporated. Thank you very much. He also just had dinner, or it was involved with one of our past panelists, Ed Glazer, and who we enjoyed having here very much. And from our own University of Rhode Island, Matt Bodah, Professor of Industrial Relations and Labor Studies. Well, that makes me even nervous to say that. It reminds me too much of those days trying to understand Social Security law. And chair of the Department of Economics at University of Rhode Island. I thank you very much for being here today. So, labor and work in a city, it's such a difficult topic. Is it possible to ever have full employment again? Don't all answer at once, you know.
Yes, it is. Okay, we were talking about this earlier. It's very hard. You know, we live in an economy right now that's suffered a very severe recession, and it's natural to look at the recession and imagine our future is going to be just like this forever. It's sort of how people in the 1930s felt. They felt that the Great Depression happened. There really wasn't any hope, right? But they were wrong. They were, everything that they thought about, caused the Depression at the time. Everything they thought was going to be true about their futures turned out not to be quite right. Some of them didn't live, of course, to see those futures. They died in World War II. But in terms of the economy, it really did. They were wrong about that, and we'll probably be wrong about this too. Okay, so yes, we can have full employment again. We're very far from it, right? And we could have had much more of it the last few years than we did. I'm optimistic about that. There are things that we'll probably get to that I think are more telling in terms of where we're headed than purely full employment.
Joan, what kind of? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Let's start out on too optimistic a note on that front. In that, I think there's many things working in the other direction that there has to be a strong policy response against. So, a week or so ago, the New York Times had a front page article on how part-time work was being rethought of and how technology enabled more part-time work. And one of the examples was, I think it was Jamba Juice. And they could figure out from the temperature of a particular day how to employ people. So you might bring in, 5 or 6 workers and have them work, but you wouldn't know. But this, they could chunk it down into 15-minute segments and determine how many workers and how many hours. So I think the move toward more part-time work, contingent work, increases, and that would require, policy measures.
Absolutely.
And then looking at it internationally, we are getting more and more efficient. And I think full employment worldwide is going to be very difficult to achieve in the short and the long term.
Matt?
Well, I think one of the reasons I'm on this panel is not because I have near the level of expertise as my 2 colleagues here, but because I'm local.
It's your looks.
Because I'm local and maybe could bring a little bit of local knowledge to this. And I think that, I'd like to be optimistic. It's not that easy to be optimistic right now for a couple of different reasons. One is, I recently saw the statistic. Actually, I have the precise number in front of me about the number of unemployed in Rhode Island, which is about 58 to 59,000, and recently heard that there are only about 10,000 jobs being posted in Rhode Island right now. Now, I realize that not all, a lot of people find work through word of mouth and through friends, and it's not always respond to a job posting, but we certainly do have this real problem with the number of jobs available and the number of people who are looking for work. To Joan's point as well, if you look at the number of even those job postings, I think if you were to, I don't have the exact figures, but if you were to compare those job postings today with a similar set of job postings even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and look at the number that are part-time without benefits, there's a problem. I mean, there's even of that 10,000, a lot of them are certainly not jobs that are going to pay a living wage.
So we're talking about in the United States a culture of neoliberalism that decides not to invest in the public sector, is valorizing pulling yourself up by the bootstraps rather than recognizing the role the government has traditionally had in a boom time economy, an economy itself which has fallen prey to the gambling instincts of Wall Street and of derivatives economies, and a globalized economy that's placing jobs around the world. Within this context, are we seeing a leveling of the United States to meet other countries around the world so that perhaps not even Western Europe, but I would say more countries like in South America, where we just have to have a new normal and a realization of a new normal so that we don't have the 1950s boom anymore that we all, not all of us, there are many younger ones in here, but certainly I came to expect. Is it a problem of expectation? Should we all realize that we're in a new normal now?
I think that's very dangerous. And, you see that happening in so many ways. For example, look how teachers in Wisconsin, when they tried to disband unions, and they were made to look like they were, leeches on the system, because they got a decent wage and not really, true middle class wage and benefits. So, I mean, it's really sad to think that's what we're coming from, where we say, well, why should they have benefits? As opposed to looking, say, unionized hotel workers in New York that have a very nice package of benefits. And instead of looking and saying, shouldn't everyone have that, we are moving to, this idea that expectations should somehow be lowered.
I think there are two strands or two issues that you raised in that question. I'm going to respond separately to them because I think it's useful to separate them. The first has to do with the role of government in sort of economic growth and job creation. There's conservatives like to talk about how government doesn't create jobs, right? And when I teach classes, one of the things I will point out to my students is that that's just ridiculous. Okay, government does many things to create jobs. Government has always done many things in our country to create jobs, right? The most basic thing that it does is it creates the institutions that our economy has that allow people to invest in capital and hire people, right? There are many countries around the world where that's not true, and their standard of living is terrible, right? So that's a fundamental thing that government does. Government has also invested in many, many things over the course of our country's history that have had profound effects on our economy.
Like what?
Well, just take the 20th century. Let's just think of the interstate highway system. Right? Imagine what the United States would be like if we didn't have the interstate highway system, right? Or the railroads in the 19th century. All these things, this infrastructure, all that's very essential. Research and development that we've invested in the last 50 years, very, very essential. So that's one strand of what you were talking about. And then you also brought in other countries. And there I think you have to think about our position in the world and the position of other high-income countries. Our current economic problems is, putting them aside, we're an extremely wealthy country, very high-income country compared with the vast majority of people around the world. But over the last 100 years, the last 50 years at least, and certainly even more so in the last 20 years or so, there's been convergence between our country and other countries around the world. That's not a bad thing. I don't feel threatened that Brazilians are now experiencing economic growth, or I'm happy that Indians are now experiencing economic growth, and thankfully the Chinese are experiencing economic growth. And in the grand scheme of things, that's good for the world and that's good for the United States. It has distributional effects on us, though, that are profound in terms of who benefits from this as well. And unfortunately, we haven't done much in the last 20, 25 years to sort of ameliorate those distributional effects. Some of those effects are very severe on people with high school degrees in the United States. Those are people who really are affected negatively by these trends.
Matt, doesn't the distribution of the income and the disparity in wealth, wouldn't that hurt job creation as well?
You mean the growing, growing
in a Fordist-based economy, Ford understood that he should pay his workers a certain amount of money, and they would buy his cars.
Right.
So is it true, perhaps, that global capitalism doesn't need us as consumers in the same way anymore, and perhaps is pretty much fine with the fact that we will continue to buy our clothes at Marshall's and Walmart and produced cheaply in China or Bangladesh?
Yeah, I think there perhaps has been a shift in that direction in the sense that rather than trying to create more consumers by increasing their wages, you try to create them by just holding prices down. And we were talking about Walmart earlier out before the session, and it's sort of that model of just kind of constantly squeezing more on the price end rather than trying to create a more vigorous middle class through increasing compensation.
Which, Joan, I would assume also would have implications in terms of people's willingness to participate in the economics and civic world of a government. Once you basically reduce people's wages, once you get them nervous and only doing part-time jobs, I would think that their civic engagement certainly in a political and a voter-oriented society, would be less and less, and their interest in ecological over economics would continue to be a constant dichotomy. And I wonder where that would put the consensus that you think you need to produce the jobs based on infrastructure and ecology.
I think there's different aspects of what you raise. So in terms of, does the fact that say in a two-parent family, both parents are working multiple part-time jobs affect their civic engagement? Of course it does. And I think the other thing that's really harmful, it also affects their ability to engage in their children's life and their children's education. And we're seeing huge bifurcation in terms of what middle-class families can do and what poor families can do to help their children get a start in the next generation. In terms of their ability to have concerns over things like the environment, probably, but I think the other thing, as we were talking earlier, as 3 rather dramatic hurricanes within a period of 10 years in the United States, that we're going to quickly be at a point where we can't afford at all to ignore what's going on in the environment. And so I think that what we see now is our infrastructure is quite vulnerable to rising sea levels, to more dramatic storms. And so whether you're an environmentalist or not, it will necessitate the rebuilding of much infrastructure, which will be good for the economy.
So I gave you $100 billion, okay? Well, 101. Okay. And don't ask for any more. That's all you're going to get. What would you do with it, and how would that increase jobs?
Well, just look at how many cities and states bridge infrastructure. You know, the sewage systems, the water and sewage systems in so many cities are near collapse, and they're tremendously expensive. And while you're under there doing that kind of infrastructure, I would invest heavily in district heating, which is, I would argue, the single most important thing cities could do to double the energy efficiency.
What is district heating?
In a normal power production system, whether you're burning biofuel, coal, or gas, you've got about a 50% efficiency. What happens is you burn the fuel to make your electricity. The rest of it goes out the chimney. And district heating takes that heat, moves it as steam through underground pipes for heating and cooling throughout a city, taking that efficiency up to 80 to 90%. Being done in Northern European cities for decades. That would be one thing while I was underground in cities. And we're going to have to rebuild infrastructure to decide what to do with our coastline. So roads, bridges, sewer systems, all that kind of stuff.
And you're not even mentioning the global warming situation and what the conjectured, at least, causes of it are.
Well,
and how to ameliorate those.
Well, right. So there's mitigation strategies to try to stop global warming, and that's where we focused at the city level on energy efficiency, renewable energy. Part of the reason we focus that way is because the adaptation is so expensive. How do you think about what you need to do to the New York City metro system in an era of climate change?
So, there's a question here. Let's see.
Order of magnitude question. Will 101 billion, what is the total impact of 101 billion on the sewage and water? Most city sewage and water systems are 100 to 150 years old.
Right.
They're all going to have to be replaced. I saw a figure of 2.5 trillion. Does that seem
so greedy? I give you,
and I'll take just 1%.
Well, all I got was 101 billion. But you're absolutely right in terms of the order of magnitude of what it will cost.
Yeah.
So I have different responses to that question. Okay? Mm-hmm. I'm an economic historian in my professional life, which means I study the history of the economy, essentially the American economy, over long periods of time. So my instinct in responding to that question, thinking in the long term, is very different from the short term. In the short term, I'd spend it on stimulus. I really would. I mean, I think we should have had a much bigger stimulus a few years ago.
Well, stimulus, what kind of stimulus?
It could be almost anything. It could be almost anything. I mean, I tend to think that we should have, as I said, we should have had. That's my instinct in the short run. In the long run, I would invest a lot of it in subsidizing college attendance and education and research and development, and then a good chunk for infrastructure. That's what I would do. But in the short run, I think we should have had a bigger stimulus, and we would have lower unemployment today if we had.
Matt?
Just actually a question for my fellow panelists then. Do you think that the stimulus that's been tried was too small, or was it too diffuse in a sense was it not spent directly enough on things like infrastructure to create jobs?
I might have spent it differently. It's hard to say. Okay, I do think it was too small. That I understand why the decision was made at the time. In knowing the players, okay, knowing Larry Summers and Christy Romer. I mean, right. Knowing how these people were thinking about it, I understand why they did what they did.
Right.
But yes, I think it was too small. And now, what's the trade-off? The trouble there is the trade-off. And the trade-off in this case is, if we had had a bigger stimulus, would we have had Obamacare? Okay. And if the answer to that is no, we wouldn't have had Obamacare, that makes the trade-off very sharp. And I'm not sure how I would respond to that.
A related question, though, is so to your point about investing in education, and I think we all agree that the stimulus wasn't enough. If a good chunk of that stimulus and more had gone back to the states, so that states, and then in turn cities didn't have to lay off teachers, and
yeah, that would have been. Yeah, I'm sure there are different ways of spending.
You're talking to the microphone, Joan, when you do
it.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's okay. Yeah. Matt, did you want to say something?
No,
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, question, please.
So, what impact on jobs has the $1 trillion per year federal budget deficit and the balance of trade, which, runs around $500 billion or so a year, and is accumulating each year? What effect has all that debt had on job creation?
It's probably been negative to some degree, but I don't think it's anywhere near as large as most people imagine it to be. I mean, we have a lot of national debt. We're also a very wealthy country. Debt has risen relative to our national wealth, but I don't see markets at the present time being terribly concerned about the deficit in the short run. In the long run, it's a very serious problem, right? That's why I said I had different responses to this question, how I would spend the money in the short run versus the long run. My instincts differ in those two cases.
Define short run and long run.
Short run is right now, is like today.
2 years, 3 years?
2 years, 3 years. Long run is 50 years. Okay.
But the debt to GDP ratio is nowhere, it was higher.
Yeah,
it's not like now we're in this period of
bother me.
Yeah,
of
it being so high. I mean, the point is we need stimulus, not debt reduction.
Right.
Well, I don't know if this is a question.
Okay.
It's a question. I just don't know how to frame it. So the conversation about new normal, and I heard some reference to Walmart. I'm sorry I came and didn't catch the conversation before the panel. But so isn't the new normal that employees at Walmart can afford to shop at Walmart the way they could buy a Ford in the old days at Ford? Because when they apply, they also get an application for food stamps. They also get the application for S-chips. I mean, isn't it all kind of government stimulus for Walmart in order to let them pay their employees a lower wage? And that seems a disconnect. So is that the new normal? Is the new normal that will vilify people for getting benefits from the government, even though that's actually more of a stimulus to the Walmarts of the world? Or was that a question?
No, it's fine. It's fine. I guess the answer, I certainly hope that that's not the case. I can certainly imagine that might happen. The way I think about the new normal, if you might want to put it that way, is in terms of thinking about what in the past created rising incomes and good jobs for Americans, and what might do so in the future. Okay, And in those senses, what the new normal is that in the last 20 years or so, we've had a very polarized job market. And I mean that there's in a sort of technical way in which there's sort of different dimensions or different ends to the job market. I'll call it a very high end, and then there's a low end. And historically, in the United States, we had a middle, right? And there were lots of different ways in which people could enter the middle class. And what we've seen in the last 20 years is that middle is disappearing. And that's what I mean by polarization, right? Now that might be the new normal, and that certainly frightens me. Okay, that is not something that I want to see, and that is, if there's a consequence of rising inequality, that's its most stark consequence, right?
So I think I got my question then, which is the dissolution of unionism the actual cause of the new normal?
I'll respond very briefly, but let other people too. It's one cause. Right? There are many causes of it. That's one cause. But it's important to keep in mind that these sorts of things have happened constantly through our history. There's always been a race. Two friends of mine have written a book called The Race Between Education and Technology. There's always been a race in the United States between technology and its effect on jobs and people getting the skills to fill those new jobs. There's always been that. It's been true since day one. We're losing that race. We've lost that race for the last 20, 25 years. And this is one of the consequences that we see. We see this middle disappearing. For people who are capable of doing extremely advanced math, I have a niece who is a math teacher in New York who married her college sweetheart, who was a mathematician, and he got a math PhD. And now he works at a hedge fund in New York. Okay, he doesn't teach mathematics. He's not a faculty member in mathematics. He works at a hedge fund. Okay, they escaped the storm the other day. They're fine. He's fine. He's in great shape. Okay, right. But there aren't many people. Those are rare things, and that is the way our economy is heading. Right.
So, please, Joan.
I think education itself, of course, the relationship between education and income has always been positive, and that's always, for any individual, your best hedge against being in one of those low-income jobs that doesn't have benefits. So, yes, unions are very important to achieving that, but I think increasingly what we're seeing, even education not working. So look at the number of college graduates coming out that aren't able to get decent paying jobs with benefits. And a distinction made by Princeton economist Alan Blinder is between jobs that can be done over the internet and jobs that can't. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with high skill. So jobs like a tax accountant, reading x-rays, a number of things, even I would say your niece's husband, those are jobs that eventually could be outsourced to a highly educated Indian labor force for much cheaper. So no one is really in kind of this international economy guaranteed that even their education is going to be the answer.
Matt?
Well, just since my field is industrial relations, I'd like to just respond to your comment about the unionization effects. And as a social scientist, I would never argue that any one variable explains everything. But I think if you were to say chart the union density rates, which peaked in the mid 1950s. And at about 35%, and back then that was before most public sector workers had a legal right to collective bargaining, so that was mainly private sector. And now in the private sector, down to below 8%. And then if you were to put another line on that chart, which was Gini coefficient or some sort of measure of income disparity, they parallel each other pretty well. Now, I wouldn't, again, that doesn't prove causation or anything like that, but I personally, I think it's there's something going on there, and it just makes perfect sense as well that a lack of bargaining power on the part of workers is going to probably lead to an erosion in their compensation. I kind of wonder and I ponder and worry about, collective bargaining was relatively resilient for quite a while, starting with craft bargaining in the late 19th century and then getting a big jolt with industrial unionism in the 30s and then getting another jolt with public sector bargaining in the 60s. And I don't know what the next jolt is, and certainly legal changes that have been tried to assist bargaining in the private sector haven't gone very far, and we've seen the opposite tide going in the public sector. So if it's not going to be collective bargaining, is there anything else that we can conceive of that would increase the bargaining power of workers? And I'm not really sure what that is, and something that I wonder about.
It does seem that we have to view the economy in global terms, because there always seems to be a race towards the bottom. Basically, in the United States, certainly President Reagan's decision to go after the air traffic controls as soon as he got in was a shot over the bow, was a way of saying, if we don't need you, and if you're going to bargain like this, we don't need this kind of. We can find other people. And the way, in some ways, people have been celebrating the auto industry. But in a way, a lot of that has to do with the dual nature of the terms of the labor agreement. In fact, some younger workers having to do wages that are much less with less benefits, while the older workers are able to maintain their pensions and their wages. So in some ways, what we see happening is a decrease in wages in this country, and acceptance in some ways, at least politically, of the fact that people are not going to be able to have the kind of lifestyle that we from the baby boom and somewhat after had been able to celebrate and be part of. We're living in a different kind of world, a globalized world, where money is liquid and it can flow to the best investments. The best investments mean you cut down on labor costs, for one thing, because it's a large variable cost. So can we look at a local economy like Providence outside of the context of a global perspective?
No, we can't look at it outside of a global perspective, but I would say that, I'm a little troubled too, though, that just sort of blaming everything on globalization, because I think that we also see, in jobs that really service a local market, we also, not all of them, there are some that service a local market and at a fairly high wage, but we have seen a lot of those jobs that service a local market that there's been an erosion of the standard as well, and to me that probably is linked maybe a bit to technology, but also to the erosion of bargaining power.
Joan?
I have a response to that on a little different level, in that if we look at what do we do in the name of economic development in this country, and basically what we do, whether it's at the state level or the local level, is we offer subsidies for firms to come that probably would have come anyway without the subsidy. And I think that puts us at a real disadvantage in the global marketplace. So just look at renewable energy. We decided to invest some of the stimulus in renewable energy, and of course all you hear about is Solyndra, and not the ones that succeeded. So did China, saying we want to be a leading producer of solar and wind technology. So did Germany, very successfully. We did it at a much lower level, but what we have is 50 states and thousands of cities competing with each other. So instead of acting as one unit and saying, we've innovated so many of these technologies, we're also going to produce them, we're competing internally, and I think that really detracts from our ability to compete internationally.
Bob, did you want to address that?
Those are both very fine answers. I just add a couple of points. When we globalize, as we have for a very long time, the costs of international trade have fallen dramatically in the 20th century. When we globalize, we are essentially expanding the labor supply in the, that's available to some sense to the consumers of products in the United States. If everything we produced was within our borders, we'd be produced by the workers within our borders. But when we engage in international trade, it's suddenly expanded to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has an unlimited supply of, we think about educated workers in India or China or whatever, the people that do software stuff in India, but they're a small fraction of the world labor supply. Most of the world's labor supply is relatively low skilled and competes directly with less educated workers in the United States. Right? So there's no question that globalization has contributed to this 1% issue. Absolutely none. But at the same time, I do agree that we can overstate this. We can overstate the importance of the global economy. Most of what we produce at home. And the points about unionization and as I said earlier, technology are all part of this new normal.
I want to focus back on this issue of distribution. First of all, I was the one when we were talking outside who brought up the Walmart issue. But I brought it up with an interesting statistic. A few months ago, there was a report that came out of the Economic Policy Institute that said that found that the 6 heirs of the Walmart fortune have more wealth than the bottom 40% of the United States, and that was a pretty startling figure. But I also want just to follow up on what you said about the low wages in Walmart and that kind of thing. If you look over the last 30 years from, say, 1980. The amount of debt as a share of GDP has gone up continuously. Now, it's fluctuated in spite of what people say in the campaigns. During Reagan's years, the national debt went up, and it was military spending. And then during the 90s, it switched to consumer debt, and now we're back to federal debt being the lion's share. But still, debt has come up, and that's how people have managed to buy homes and so on, which opened up international money markets, derivatives, and all these creative ways of financing, subprime lending and so on. That was part of it. Now, I'm a strong believer that part of the cost of living is built into your built environment, so that with our post-World War II suburbanization, we have a high cost of living built in. And that's why our debt has gone up, but it's created all these kinds of issues. But there's another statistic like the one about Walmart that I want to throw out. In about a week, I'll be showing my labor economics class a video of Paul Krugman where he gives a figure that one hedge fund manager around 2007, 2008 received a bonus that was equivalent to paying all school teachers in New York City for the next 3 years. And that to me, I mean, it's a good sort of iconic number, because if that hedge fund manager had cut back his income by 2/3 and only had 1 year's worth of all school teachers in New York City, you could then double in a given year the number of school teachers. You could double your school teacher force. And we're not talking about low-educated, low-wage jobs. We're talking about middle-income jobs. So the point is that it's a striking example of these things are distributional issues, and it could relate to union power, could relate to other kinds of things. But I think we get caught up in the idea that education, your wage reflects education, and therefore if we educate everybody, wages will all go up. It may be true a bit, but I don't think, if you have 10 jobs and the top 3 of the most require the most education, you educate everybody, you're still going to have only 3 jobs that are having high education. There may be some other things. So I'd like to ask you to address some of the other ways. We've talked about unions, we've talked about education, ways of having a more equitable distribution system, and what it would take to make the distribution of wealth in the United States be more equitable.
Okay, the revolution starts now. Let's go. How do we do it? I mean, how do we educate people to recognize that they have some civic responsibility and civic some to be active agents in the process?
I don't think there are too many hedge fund managers out there who will voluntarily give up a share of their income equivalent to what they would have been taxed had they been working in 1952. So in the immediate post-World War II era, income tax rates were very high. We didn't have hedge funds back then, partly because some of the intellectual technology that's associated with the creation of hedge funds hadn't been invented, and neither had the computers that are helpful in producing these kinds of firms. But if we had, that would have been one way to do it. I do happen to think that, I'm pretty confident who's going to win the election tomorrow. All right. I'm not confident that that's going to translate into an elimination of the current low rate of taxation on carried interest for hedge fund managers. Right. But that would be something I'd like to see done. I actually don't think that would have much effect on the labor supply of hedge fund managers. I think they'd work just as many hours as they do, and they just complain about the fact that they had to give over 30% of their income. But I don't think it would have much effect on their labor supply. And so, as a positive economist, as we say, that's a perfectly good thing to tax, just like cigarettes.
But I think also that there's at some point it becomes politically untenable to maintain that kind of polarization and disparity. And as we were talking earlier, we saw a little window open where we had the Wall Street demonstrations, the 99%ers caught on a little bit. We saw the same thing going on in Israel. We saw it in China. We are seeing it in response to the draconian measures against Greece and Spain. And so you can only squeeze people so much, and then you start to get political unrest. And I think that will ultimately result in some changes.
Well, you've kind of moved on a whole other level here. But
Yeah.
I was thinking before, it's very interesting what's going on in China now as people are starting to say, no, we don't want this factory here if it means having to deal with the pollution. And, there have been things going on in India, and I'm wondering, will there always be this inexhaustible cheap labor source that our economy seems to be now founded upon, this cheap labor source? And so it's interesting because as our unions keep yielding more and more, now you see in other parts of the world people are starting to demand more. And what ultimately will happen with that?
I think that's a very good point. One of the important trends in the United States in the 20th century is that we work fewer hours nowadays than we did in the early 20th century, a lot fewer. Okay, that's not because we're unemployed all the time. That's a long-run trend. We'll see that in China. Okay, we will see changes of that form. People will be demanding more leisure time, more in the way of environmental controls. I'm quite confident that that's going to happen.
But how will that affect us?
We will pay relatively more for textiles.
Or they'll just move.
Or they'll move somewhere else.
Right, they are moving to
They already are
Vietnam
moving.
and Thailand. Yeah.
They already are.
Actually, we'll be providing the leisure time for the Chinese on vacation.
Maybe just add a little bit to that. Just on the Chinese situation, and I think Bob's been to China.
is it possible that new priorities need to be set in place, new ways of distributing, new ways of creating wealth, new ways of understanding what value indeed really is, rather than through a market system? Is there a way of looking at economics in a whole different way for different purposes? Is, for instance, what's the country that has the index of happiness? You know, Bhutan. I mean, obviously, it's a small country with very little, many happy people. What's that? To Myanmar, that's true. So, you know, do we look at this differently now? Is there a way of looking at the future differently than we've looked at it, you know, by the lenses of our baby boom, our consumer culture, our, you know, sort of semi-obsessive work relationships that we have to our lives?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm an economist. I'm a professional economist. I belong to a different tribe, or actually, I should say, different branch of humanity is probably a better way to put it. And you know, we're partly to blame. I mean, we've glorified GNP as a measure of well-being, and it isn't, right? And what we want is an economy that maximizes our, we would call utility, our well-being, very broadly, right? You know, it's very important to keep in mind that the American economy, you know, has been an enormous success story at reducing inequality over long periods of time. You know, and you know, think about, you know, in this country we you know, have tremendous racial problems and tremendous racial differences, for example, in incomes and other things. But today they're much, much smaller than they were 100 years ago. You know, we have really created a more equal society relative to what we had. Okay, and in some sense, our biggest deficits are not consumer items, right? So yes, I agree with you. I mean, we could. My mentor in my field is a man named Robert Fogel. He was a Nobel Prize winner in economics and economic history, and this is a point that he's made over and over again. You know, that you know, those are the real deficits, the spiritual deficits and things in American society. So yes, we can certainly imagine that, right? And economics could do a much better job at selling that as a sort of a goal.
Or the Nobel Prize-winning economist, the woman Elsinore, who believed in
Eleanor Nostrum.
Ostrom, who believed in and worked with the issue of the commons and the way in which there's a lot more to be done with self-regulation within ecological structures. Am I right? You know, so there's something called participatory economy out there, and it has to do with, you know, community gardens and creating currency that distributes itself in different ways, creates value in different ways. There seems to be underground sort of a redefining a bit of why work and what work is for, and is there a way in which to create a society that doesn't exactly put the same premium on the acquisition of wealth in a traditional way, but actually on a more deeply internal way?
One of the most frustrating things, I think I can be heard.
Okay, we can hear you.
I think you
One
can
of the
too.
most frustrating things is that you have the colleges and universities trumpeting, you know, their renewed approach to their programs, and that everything is focused on a business model, a corporate model. The curriculum of the university is producing people who will be in criminal justice, will be CNAs, will count pills at a pharmacy, and the dissing and the general disregard of a general liberal arts education is just, you know, it is just sickening to me. So in order to have people rethink what is important, you have to have people who can think critically. And this is not what our universities are focusing on. I mean, I think Mr. Dooley at University of Rhode Island, the whole front page of the journal recently was about how he's going to build technology courses at both the southern and northern ends of the state, but you hear nothing about expanding liberal arts. So I think it's a very sad state of affairs in our colleges and universities.
Well, I agree with your statement, but I think there's an important distinction between a community college system and the universities. So when you look at the community colleges preparing people for the criminal justice system, one could make a big argument that it's an industry in and of itself and a job creation machine. But we need people in pharmacies to do those. We need CNAs to do those. So I think the question is not, there's always going to be those jobs that are relatively low skilled that we need. But how do we make those jobs so that one can feel a sense of pride about what they do, that how one can earn a decent living? And that takes us back to some of the things we talked about earlier in unionization. So rather to say, there's these low-skilled jobs, we need to redefine how we think about those jobs that are really necessary for our country, in every country.
Matt or Bob? Matt?
Well, I just want to make a couple of quick comments because I think it's a really important question that you raise, and I don't know if we might disagree on some of it, but I think that the land grant university system was established to have a certain role, a certain economic role, and I also I'm a little uncomfortable. I think when we start to pit, say, the humanities against, say, a professional education or something that's more focused on workforce development or economics or whatever it might be. I think I do agree that we have to, we always have to integrate the humanities and the liberal arts and social sciences into what we do, or else we are just a training school, and we don't want to be just a training school. But I also don't I'm a little uncomfortable too with just saying, well, let's not get involved in crass commerce or whatever, because I think we wouldn't have the land grant system if there wasn't some economic role for universities. And I think we got to probably do a better job of thinking this through. I was called to a meeting not too long ago in this building at the Office of Higher Ed to start to try to think about the university's role in workforce development, and we probably don't do a very good job with that here in terms of really having a vision for what it all means and bringing it all together.
Bob, I know you're a good proponent of education. What kind of education are you talking about?
I'm very sympathetic to your point of view. I think it's extremely difficult to predict, our future economy. I can look at the past and probably give you a pretty good estimate of what GNP will be, in the next. You might think sounds ridiculous, but I think I give you a pretty good estimate of what it's likely to be in, say, 10 years, roughly. Okay. I couldn't begin to tell you what the occupational structure of the United States is going to look like 25 years from now. And to me, that says that if we attempt to train people for very specific things, like you're talking about, at the expense of critical thinking skills, the sort of things that allow you to be flexible over your life, that's a recipe for trouble, right? Because one of the great benefits historically of American education has been flexibility. It's been people being able to move into different parts of the country, into different jobs, because they had basic skills that transferred from one thing to another. One other point, I just wanted to follow up on Joan's point about the role of basically becoming a pharmacist's assistant and having, a middle class job. I don't know how many people here have ever been to Norway. Okay, if you go to Norway, to Oslo, and you go out to eat at a restaurant, you'll be completely shocked at how expensive it is. Incredibly expensive, right? No one goes out to eat in Norway except, tourists who don't know any better and people on expense accounts. Now, why is that? Because the Norwegians, Norway is a very high income country. It's a beautiful, why is that? It's because they actually, have, they regulate their minimum wages for restaurant workers are such that, yes, you can have a middle-class lifestyle in Norway as a waiter. You don't go out to eat, right? But you have that. So there are countries around the world. Something we forget is there are countries around the world that have much lower levels of inequality in the United States and perfectly fine standards of living, right? This is not the only, what we have here is not the only model, for economic success.
Could I just push back a little bit on, we're treating this as either or instead of both and. And so I think the point I was making about, we need a CNA, but we also need a CNA who has critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
And so the way we have defined CNA education to be, depending on the state you're in, anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks is ridiculous. That could be redefined as a job that gets more training, that's much higher skilled. Similarly, can you create a career path for someone who starts out as that pharmacy technician but has a career path if he or she wants to move up to higher levels within the broader healthcare industry, but it's perfectly respectable if you want to stay a pharmacy technician. So I think you can build higher order thinking skills, humanities, and so forth into training and not think of it that it has to be the way it is right now.
I'm going to take one more question in this direction, then I want to get into some local stuff here in Providence. So.
Well, this actually may be a good segue to bridge into that because I want to push back against what you said, Matt, about the land grant. Just because I think the land grant has been, in almost an Orwellian way, been redefined from what it originally started out to be. And if we can resurrect or remember what the land grant was originally, we might be able to have a broader vision. So, first of all, the land grant was passed by, it was championed by and passed by Republicans. But that was at a time when the Republican Party was led by socialists, or people who were highly influenced by socialism, people like Horace Greeley. And if you read Eric Foner's book on Free Land, Free Labor, and you read Lincoln's speeches at that time, the model that they had was a country of owner-operators, basically, and if you had larger, more complex organizations, they would be workers' cooperatives. And that's why, for example, Jonathan Baldwin Turner, the man who first proposed the land grant, famously said, education will usher in the millennium of labor. That was what the land grant was supposed to be about. And if you fast forward, for example, to Morrill's speech on the 25th anniversary of the land grant, there are two things that I think are really interesting about that speech, if you've ever read it. One is he says clearly, we didn't intend for this to be a thing which would train farmers to plow and mechanics to saw. What we did is we put those things in to tempt them to come to university because we thought it would get more people, and we wanted to give them a liberal education. So that was the main goal of the land grant. The other thing about that speech that I thought is really interesting is that in the entire speech, the only university he mentions by name is Cornell. After talking about how many students have graduated and how many universities have started, at a time when Yale was still a land grant and Brown was still a land grant, when the school we now call MIT was a land grant and still is a land grant, most people don't know that, he chose the school that was only about 18 years old as his iconic land grant that he praised. And if you look at Cornell, it was designed by a guy named Andrew Dixon White, who had a number of things for which he was famous, but basically the two things I would stress is one, that it's supposed to be a place where people seek truth for its own sake, and from that he also in his various writings said it would be a place free of commercial, religious, and political influence. Those are direct quotes from White. The other thing would be broad and balanced, including all areas of higher education being balanced between them. And that balance, I think if you look at White's own personal history, he was a historian who wrote a lot about the relation between science and religion, and his main book spent the most space talking about Galileo's trial. And he had this image of a university as being not an ivory tower, because he also wanted to have applied subjects taught, but a place that was independent and not seen as or not actually being at the behest of commercial interests and corporations and so on. I should also mention that Turner, after the Civil War, he became an enemy of corporations. So this was what the politics of the land grant was, and that the idea that somehow this was yes, it was economic development. He wanted these people to be able to be competitive with the growing commercial, capitalism that was taking shape. But it wasn't to be something that was simply at the behest of commercial interests. It was very different. It was something to be independent and focused on this more Enlightenment idea of what a university should be. That was what the land grant was about. And still, in my opinion, I agree, is what we should be when we forget that.
So, land grant as maybe from your point of view, as a sort of a way of organizing education for the future so that it combines both practical as well as theoretical, and the way in which you have agency in doing your job to give you a sense of self-worth and possibility. Is that simply... It's a big discussion. Okay. Couple of things. I want to get to practical stuff here in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, we have an economy that's suffering, even more so than its neighbors. We also, in Providence, Rhode Island, where obviously we're located, and one of our provinces is to figure out how to deal with this issue. We have territory under where 195 was. And it's great because in Rhode Island, we always talk about where it was. So we have where 195 used to be. A lot of acreage, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 acres, whatever it is. And there's all kinds of schemes and plans. And what's been dropped down onto the city of Providence has been various schemes. And I'm curious about your ideas. One, of course, is the Knowledge District. The idea that somehow we coordinate our development with universities, biotech facilities, medical facilities, different kinds of industries that seem to be on the up and coming. Well, to move it, yeah, you wonder who's knowledgeable and who isn't. The other is the creative class one. Richard Florida has been here and has talked in a lot about how to develop an economy based on the creative class. At the same time, there is an indigenous economy here that has been generated by the arts, but more underground arts. Groups like AS220, for instance, the Steel Yard, things like Steve focused on in his discussion, stuff that actually generated restaurants and it generated small businesses. Industry that encourages incubation of creative activities. How do you stand on these, both in terms of the specifics of this particular location, but in general? How has this succeeded or failed in other places around the world?
I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. And so...
Which one?
The whole idea of arts, creative class, and so forth, that there has to be some kind of critical mass that's driving an economy that then creates that. But, the town that I have the most close experience with is spending August in Lenox, Massachusetts, the home of Tanglewood. And Pittsfield, just to the north, was one of the biggest manufacturing places in the state. And Pittsfield lost its manufacturing economy, but has still maintained downtown life. And one of the things they've tried to do is build an arts and community. They've built a theater, and they've been moderately successful. I mean, there is a life in Pittsfield, and you would think if any place should be able to do that when they've got Tanglewood, they've got all of these entities right there, and they can't. And so I think it just says that is not enough. And so the idea of, particularly in a place that has prominent universities, trying to link innovation and universities around strengths is a very successful strategy. It doesn't mean you have to pick an industry, but broadly, biotechnology, which I guess there's been very bad experiences with here in Rhode Island that I don't know about. So,
gaming has been problematic.
Biotechnology. Gaming, but different things these are a lot of the things I wrote about in Emerald Cities. And one of my favorite cities in this regard is Toledo, Ohio, that building off an auto glass industry, a town and an industry that was in severe decline. But related to this was research going on at the University of Toledo in glass, but also in solar, because what is a solar panel if not a glass product? And so they were able to use their manufacturing expertise to build in an area of the new economy. As a result of that, others in the area got the idea. So Johnson Controls is just investing some $300 million in modernizing and expanding a facility to move from traditional batteries to, it's not lithium ion, but it's another kind of battery. And, Toledo is still in a lot of trouble, but it's finding its way with new sectors. And I think
building on strength, building on history, connecting to innovative industries.
Exactly.
And creating a regional logic so that one company in this, like the auto industry, fed a tire industry or fed a glass industry.
Yeah. And I mean, it's going to fail. So look at 123. A battery company started in Massachusetts from research in MIT, a lot of investment in facilities in Michigan, assuming we're going to have electric cars, just recently declared bankruptcy, but it's really a restructuring. So this doesn't always work, but generally if you're spinning off a lot of innovation, some of it's going to take and hold.
Yeah, Paul?
Earlier, you had mentioned in previous panels, people talked about the importance of innovative mayors. You talked about competition between states. If you were talking purely as economists or planners in terms of units of analysis, in terms of thinking about how to move the economy forward, what would it be? Would it be regions? In other words, should we say to our mayor, do not compete with other cities, make alliances regionally? Maybe they're already trying to do that. But you mentioned, Joan, before that there are 50 states competing with each other. If we could somehow get people to think in terms of the unit of intervention that's necessary rather than the geopolitical units, what would they be?
Regions, broadly defined. But the problem is there are political units within those regions that make it impossible. So obviously there's a regional... Huh?
It's not a good answer for somebody that wants... I haven't read your book, but it's not a good answer for somebody that wants to talk about sustainability and change and vision. You either need to think outside of what exists, right? And say, if we're going to plan, we need to plan regionally, and these political people that are elected by the people need to do that for us, because if they just do their interests in their states, we're not going to get there, is what you're saying.
It is, and it's not a good answer, but it's the reality. So how long, Marshall, have we known that economic development subsidies, do not work, and yet it continues to be the driver? How long have we talked about regionalism and regional economies, but trying to get, politicians to cede or to sign agreements?
How come people have done that municipally? How come people have gone to metropolitan areas instead of just individual cities? Why don't we do that as states? Rhode Island's a very small state. Why don't we either join with Massachusetts or Connecticut?
We do it. We do it along. Yeah, I know. We do it along very small things. So there'll be a metropolitan sewer district. But when it comes to distributing money, it becomes a very different issue. So, I couldn't agree with you more in principle. But it's just that if we look at regional governance, you can count on one or two hands how much you see it in the United States. If you talk about tax-based sharing. I think we have the Twin Cities as our sole example of that. And, if it's such a great idea, why can't you get everyone to do it? So I agree there has to be innovation in thinking about government and government units and non-competition. But, politically, we are divided the way we are. And
I'll give you an example. I spent time in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Las Vegas, New Mexico might have 25,000 people, 30,000 people. There's a Las Vegas school system and a West Las Vegas school system. And as much as they've tried, they've never been able to unify the two. Both have their bureaucracies. There's racial issues between the two. And most of the expense of the public education goes into administrators rather than into the education system itself. It's unfortunately there's this constant dichotomy between what sounds good and what feels good and what is real. That's what it seems.
I don't like the idea of what's real because
quote real, yeah.
What happens is if it gets bad enough, then
right.
School systems will
Yeah.
Terre Haute in our state has 3 regional schools. I'm saying that if things get bad enough, then people will think of the units that they need to do something with, and the populace will demand the change, because otherwise we're locked into failure, essentially.
Mark, I was going to say,
Yeah.
I think we need the people to have the microphone so that they
Oh, sorry, the microphone. Sorry, yeah, I'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get you that. I want to go back just for a second. Do you think there's any validity in this knowledge district? Is there any validity in the creative, Richard Florida's work? Is there?
Absolutely. I mean, I want to make just a couple points on this general question. You know, again, going back to something I said earlier, it's very, very hard to predict what our economy is going to be 20 years. In fact, it's not something I would do. I just think it's not productive. It's a lot easier to go back and look and see what worked and, identify those things that are correlated with what works and what doesn't. And, Richard has done a valuable service. And in fact, there is a very, if you look across metropolitan areas in the United States over the last, say, 30 years, and you say, what factors can we measure that are correlated with success of those areas, employment growth, okay? They're not many, but there are some, okay? And one of them is, again, the role of education and also this creative class. He emphasizes what he calls the creative class, but it's, to some degree, it's much more general than that, and it doesn't have to be just artists. I mean, this is something that you had Ed Glazer here,
right.
And I don't know what he said, but I would assume he would have brought this up, that this is a very strong predictor of metropolitan success. I look at Providence. When you were talking about not doing well, and I looked at the statistics too before coming down here, and I had a somewhat different view. I mean, it's not great, but I grew up in Detroit. Okay, I let me tell you, I think I come to Providence all the time. I think it's a great city. I think you're doing much better than my hometown. Okay, and I think the possibilities for further success here are much, much better than they are in the Motor City. Okay, and to some extent that has to do with the educational institutions here and the fact that you have transformed your downtown, right? So there is that possibility of success. The other thing that's correlated with growth, by the way, is entrepreneurial activity. Okay, so if you have a city where there are a lot of startups, where there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity, that's a very strong predictor of employment growth over time. Of the various policy levers that people have, though, that's not an easy one to deal with. I mean, if you asked me, gee, can I go out and create, another 1,000 entrepreneurs tomorrow by doing X? Beats me. Okay, that's a very hard thing. But anything that encourages that will certainly be associated with growth.
Matt?
Yeah, just a couple of points. Currently, education and healthcare account for about 28.3% of employment in Providence. So it's if you put those two together, it's the biggest sector. Actually, you mentioned arts and hospitality together is 15%, which is actually the second largest sector, with manufacturing at 14.6% and retail at 11.6%. I guess I'm hopeful about the Knowledge District. I'm hopeful about URI's role in the Knowledge District. I'm a little concerned. It was actually something I heard in this room a couple years ago at the Marker Feld lecture. It was a gentleman. I can't remember his name. I'm sure someone can help me out. He was from UPenn, who was speaking. John Landis. And he was mentioning, he's talking about Pittsburgh, and a lot of times people look, at Pittsburgh is sort of like the holy grail of all this, right? That steel industry died, and along came eds and meds, and now everybody wants to be like Pittsburgh. But he said something that's kind of, I didn't know, but it was kind of interesting that, it really hasn't done a whole lot for the people who lost their jobs in the steel industry. It just brought in the creative class and the folks, the well-educated people to get jobs at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and things like that. So I guess that's my concern is, maybe as a native Rhode Islander, and so I went to high school in Providence and all this kind of thing, that, I'm all for it, and I hope it works out really well, but is it going to help the people here in the city who have, lost jobs that were in manufacturing and things like that, or isn't it? And I think some of Joan's work that I've read, where you talk a lot about jobs with career ladders and things like that, and some of these we can bring people in at the at the bottom rung, but that they have a means to rise up and not just keep filling the top by just attracting people in is, I think, something important.
I know, lastly, again, it's been talked about how do you basically compost a city? How do you create the compost through which a urban environment grows? Huh? What's that? Well, people have told me I'm full of compost, or another way of saying it. But Bert has talked about that to me a lot, about composting the culture in a city to create innovation, in an education system within the schools, in a democratic involvement in different choices that the city will make. And you can't predict the future, but you could create the opportunities for the future to bloom rather than to believing that you're going to once again draw another company from somewhere else into Providence, Rhode Island. It seems to me that's an interesting kind of way of looking at urban development, to create the kind of culture through which people can innovate, occasionally get subsidies, have the conversations that create the sort of the critical mass of creativity, and just give it a chance to bloom, hopefully with some subsidies from government. It strikes me that might be our only hope at this point.
That's the first time I've heard that metaphor, composting an urban area, and I'm going to steal it.
Yeah, well, I got it from Bert Krenka.
And I think it's a fascinating metaphor, and I'm not sure that I would... Huh? I will footnote him. I always footnote people, but I'm not sure that I can give a. I'm not sure there's a good answer to that. I mean, it's this point that I just made a moment ago about the role of entrepreneurship in city growth is something that's relative, at least in the economics world, is relatively new, right? In terms of just noticing. Okay. And then we can go back in time and we can find examples in every city. I'm sure we go back to Providence in the late 19th century, we would find many examples of this. Okay, Pittsburgh is a good case. Pittsburgh is a very interesting case, you see, because Pittsburgh was commented on by a very important urban economist in this regard in the 1950s. His name was Benjamin Chinitz. Okay, and Chinitz argued that Pittsburgh was not going to succeed that well, even though we know in retrospect that it did pretty well, because he didn't see that entrepreneurship in Pittsburgh in the 1950s. And the reason was he just saw these big steel companies dominating the local economy, and there wasn't the innovation. Okay. Now, if he had gone back a little further, perhaps in time to the late 19th century, he would have seen a different Pittsburgh, right? So there's a life cycle to these things, right? And maybe that would be one of the implications of your knowledge district here. I mean, is that you could reinvigorate that life cycle for Providence.
To me, of course, one of the issues of the knowledge district is this detachment from the community. How can the knowledge district be integrated into the community, giving assets of that kind of creative thinking to many, many people, rather than just isolated like blocks in hotel blocks in Times Square? And to me, that's always a difficult situation, because part and parcel often of this inequality and part and parcel of this knowledge district and who gets to do it, who doesn't get to do it, is the separation of one class of people from the other. And that seems to be more and more exaggerated as time goes on. And certainly the highway of 195 did the separation initially, and we worry in some ways about the knowledge district continuing and exacerbating that kind of separation.
I don't know much about this particular knowledge district, but I think part of it is different ways of thinking about it as I piece together, from my last two books, different ways cities have done it. And so part of the problem is separating out, this is our knowledge district, and separating that out from, say, residential, commercial, and other kind of development. But also you can integrate schools into that. There's one of the worst public schools in Chicago has been taken over by Dan Swinney and given a more engineering and manufacturing perspective. So why couldn't you take that and pull together an inner city high school that would be right in the middle of that knowledge district? And those kids would have access to internships, learn about the different kinds of companies, learn different sets of skills associated with those companies in there. So I think there are ways of removing that isolation and making it really be something that is pulling a lot of people up.
Less than, as Marshall mentioned, as an office park than something much more integrated. Please.
Yeah, I want to just speak a little bit more about the Knowledge District. So what it is it's a vast area. I think you mentioned 40 acres. And right now it's green grass growing on it. The Knowledge District is this available land is next to what we used to call the Jewelry District. And in this Jewelry District, there's a number of biotechnology companies. I think there's 4 that are there. And so one of the visions is to construct a building. This is the vision that our president talked about in Sunday's paper. So one of the visions is to construct a building that would house the clinical last 2 years of the nursing programs of Rhode Island College and URI. And in that building would be incubating space for entrepreneurs in the life sciences, and also space for additional biotech or bioscience companies that would locate there. So there are about 15 small biotech companies in the greater Providence area. And I run the biotech program here at URI Providence. And so we've just organized into the Rhode Island bioscience leaders. And we're hoping to help each other to grow and to find space, to maybe share employees, share technology, because none of them are competing with each other. And the benefit that I would get would be jobs for my students or internships for my students from this. But the question I have is that it's a big piece of land. We're speaking about one building. The mayor of Providence says that while Johnson & Wales, Brown University, or probably even RISD, would like to take some of that land, he wants it all tax-bearing land. So the question is, who goes there? Who's coming to this vast area? Some people have said, we'll take companies from Cambridge, the biotech center of the world, because we've got kind of lower cost operation here in Providence. So we're kind of stealing from one region to bring to another. So that's a question. Who's going to locate in this vast tract of land? And I'll tell you just one more quick story about upward mobility. So there is a company in Rhode Island called Concordia Medical, and maybe you know this story. And it was originally started as Concordia Textiles. It was originally started from Armenian immigrants, and they had technology to make rugs. And so the company grew to a fairly large textile company, but then lost the rug business, and then went into fabrics, and then lost that business, then went into making labels for men's shirts, and then lost that business as it all went either south or to Asia. And finally, they started making kind of high-end textiles, but at the same time, they figured out that they could make something called scaffolds out of textile cloth, and grow cells on it, make body parts out of it, see. And so they founded a separate division called Concordia Medical. And they found out that when they started this company, that the present workers that they had couldn't read instructions, and they needed to be ISO certified. So they started a GED program within their company. And as mostly immigrants, because I met some of them, as they graduated and got their high school diploma, they went from Concordia Textile to Concordia Medical, and that was the route. That was the route up. So anyway, the question is who's coming to the 195 empty land.
We're going to end here after you get this last question. Matt, do you want to take it? Who's coming?
Well, I mean, I think we should end with our guests here, but I mean, I guess the plan would be that by groups like the universities and the nonprofits that tax exempt, by them doing things like signing long-term leases, will make it attractive for private developers to build these buildings and keep them on the tax rolls, and then URI signs a 99-year lease for the Well, I guess that would, that I understand, but that could be a model for more than one building. If these other schools and universities sign long-term leases, it would make it more palatable for private developers.
I think if you look to Philadelphia's Navy Yard, this was more, it sounds like this is some greenfield site somewhere, but it was a brownfield site in the city. And Penn State, other universities set up research facilities there, and it's somewhat, you could call it an innovation district, you call it an eco district. Some of them are focused on green technologies, but trying to get a lot of different things going in different sectors rather than trying to say this is going to be our biomedical area, because it's oftentimes difficult. But, I mean, it sounds to me like the mistake was choosing a 40-acre greenfield site. But
I'm going to punt on that one.
Okay. I want to end the conversation, but before I do that, I want to give you each, let's say, 3 minutes to dream, to imagine what kind of economy, what kind of jobs, what kind of world you could imagine at its most utopian way with, say, 20 years from now. Because obviously you're right. This is a very difficult and hopefully a transitional time, and hopefully a transition is towards a more deeply satisfying life and more economically secure life, and a life where there's a more sense of spiritual well-being rather than the anxiety that seems to permeate our culture at this point for a number of reasons. But how can we create something, at least imagine it, for 20 years from here, that takes us out of the paradigm that we're in now, which, especially for me, is quite pessimistic, and in fact see it in a completely different way? What would you like to see? Take off your academic, your research, your own pessimism, as I probably should, and imagine what a quality city, for instance, in this case, would look like, feel like, be like, in terms of jobs and work.
Oh, well.
You can think about it for a few years and get back to me on it.
He asked me to take off my academic hat, but I'm not going to do that. I'll keep it on. Here's what I would say. So in the late 19th century, the level of inequality in the United States was quite similar to what it is today. Okay, we think that this is a unique moment in our history, and it's not true. Okay, we've been there before. And then over the course of the next half century, inequality in the United States fell dramatically. And it did, to a large degree, part of the reason it did was, as we mentioned the growth of unions, I've mentioned and emphasized education. Certainly on the education front, we had, at that time, the great expansion was an expansion in high school graduation. Okay, we have not had the equivalent of that. Despite the growth of our university system, we simply haven't seen that. Okay, so if I could imagine a world in the next 20 years, I'd like to see that replicated. I'd like to see something like the high school movement of the early 20th century translated to our century, which is just a dramatic expansion in affordability in college education.
Joan, you got it.
I think the biggest thing affecting our economy long run is climate change, and it's something we have to address. And depending on the day of the week, I feel like we're already past the point where we can make a big difference on that front. And so I think a lot of investment into innovation to solving the problems on both sides, the mitigation, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas we produce, and adaptation, helping us because we know it's going to get worse. And so if we look at these industries and look at what is it going to be like when it gets hotter and sea levels rise, not just in the United States, but all over the world, and when we're going to have severe regional water shortages, what can we do about that? What are the technologies that can help us through that? So I think by investing in these areas and thinking about not just the innovation and the technologies, but linking that to manufacturing of those technologies so that we have repeated rounds of innovation is essential to our economy, but it's also internationally. We're not going to be the only beneficiaries, as we see countries all over the world are starting to invest in these kind of technologies.
Maybe, I'll just end talking a little bit about, I do quite a bit of work with unions and employers in the construction industry, and, it's no secret that some years ago, unionized construction was, very exclusionary, was racist, actually. Yet now I'm doing a lot of work with the parties on things called community workforce agreements, which are ways of building bridge. I serve on the advisory board of a group here in Olneyville called Building Futures, and what we do is we recruit people from disadvantaged backgrounds and give them pre-apprenticeship training so that they can get to the level where they can go into apprenticeship programs in the building trades. And so I think this is a way. We talked a little bit about the role of unions, and since it's my area, I'll maybe end with this, in that, we just gotta really figure out ways to work on these disparities and on bringing the poor into work that pays a living wage with good means of support and benefits and things like that. And so I would say that my utopian vision for the future would be that whether it's privately through collective bargaining or publicly through government, some sort of government programs or directions, whatever, is just working to get more people, to close this disparity and get more people to rise up in the workforce.
Joan Fitzgerald, Professor of Law, Public Policy Programs at Northeastern University and the author of Emerald City, Sustainability and Economic Development. Thank you. And Robert Margo, Professor of Economics and African American Studies, Boston University, and at the National Bureau of Economic Research Incorporated, and a member of the Providence Mandolin Orchestra. And Matt Bodah, thank you, Professor of Industrial Relations and Labor Studies and Chair of the Department of Economics, University of Rhode Island. Kat, I thank you. Marshall, I thank you. Steve, I thank you. Where's Tammy? Is she here? She's left. And all of you, I thank you so much. Oh, I want to just put a quick plug in, quickly. Wednesday, Louis Hine at Action Speaks. We're looking at the great photographer of child labor, Louis Hine. And then Thursday, right here, we're doing what I would modestly call one of the seminal pieces of Rhode Island. It's the, it's the history of a triple-decker, and I just had the first rehearsal again with everybody that I'd had in the last 5 years, and it's just a marvelous piece. It's a history of immigration told by Valerie Tutson and I through the perspective of a triple-decker with musicians that represent the various groups, and it's just a joy. So if you are just hanging out Thursday and finish drinking, come over and sit here, and it's 7:30, right, Steve? 7:30. So I really like you to come. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, everybody there. Thank you.